Greetings all, BWS2K here. Today we're going to go over my top 10 things to tell new Cortexers. So let's get started. Cortex Prime is primarily for collaborative serial storytelling by design. So it kind of has a language all its own. You want to think about like literary terms and that sort of wheelhouse when it comes to how you discuss a build or how you discuss certain traits and how a game flows. The book actually describes it as, I'm going to read the quote, a multi-genre, modular, session-centered role-playing game. That's on page 4. When you roll, it's an attempt to change the status quo or to influence the direction of the narrative. Traits then are factors in that process, and their rating, the die size, is a measure of their ability to change or influence that narrative. And you heard me say that before if you watched other videos on the channel. So thinking about it in those terms is going to be much easier to process the toolkit, the system, the game, the build. You absolutely can crunch it up. You can try all kinds of different things. Just don't be surprised if you find yourself sort of painted into a corner and the answer is not easy to get you out of that. Doesn't mean it's impossible. It's not going to be impossible. But sometimes if you've got a lot of crunch, if you've got rules for a lot of different things, it can be tricky to try to cortex your way out of it, because it thrives as a collaborative storytelling structure. Don't be afraid to leave fields blank on your character sheet. If you're doing pre-gens, it's okay there, and you can just fill stuff in as you go. If you are not really sure about a distinction, or you've got an extra spot for an SFX but you can't fill it in, if you leave it open, by the time you get to the end of your second or third session, something will certainly have happened that you can say, oh, hey, that's a good time to maybe I want to put area attack in, or I want to put in the distinction that I'm really good at building bridges or something like that. And so for the first couple sessions, when you're sort of growing into your character, it's okay to have things blank and then fill them in as you go. Don't be deterred, especially if you're doing a build and with pre-gens. I know that it can be tricky sometimes to nail down everything right away. It's okay to leave something open, especially if it's a pre-gen in a build and you hand it over to the players and you say, okay, there's a couple open spots there. You all can fill that in as we play. Like, that's kind of a nice way to have some ownership and some buy into the character. So don't be afraid to leave things blank. Distinctions are not as scary as they might seem. They just describe things. They are core aspects of your character, and they will always be involved, or almost always involved, in every attempt to change the status quo. Remember, we talked about that earlier. But combining what we've talked about so far, it's okay to have some blank when you first start. Most folks, when they build a character, have something in mind, and that might be something the character says a lot, that might be something they wear, that might be some cool acrobatic move, it might be a heritage or some kind of power or ability or magical thing. Those are all great stand-ins for distinctions. You can put them on, and then if you find out later on, hey, I'm not really using that particular aspect of my character, then that's what the growth mechanism is for. You can change it over time, or maybe you can ask the GM and just get a free rewrite. But they don't need to be super complex. They don't need to encompass everything. In fact, the better ones are going to be more broad and more open to interpretation. So don't be too scared. Don't be too scared of empty spaces, but also don't be too scared of distinctions themselves. If no distinctions feel relevant, hinder one and move on. If no traits feel relevant, reframe what your character is doing. And if the problem persists, ask whether a role is really even necessary. So it can take time to get into the shoes of a character. But there's also a disjointedness that can happen if you have a character who is not a good fit for a story, or a scene that's not a good fit for a build or for a story that's being told. It's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean the character is bad or the GM is bad or anything like that. It just means if you're telling a space opera romance and you have a character who is a hired mercenary who is, bloodthirsty and out to pillage and ruin, it's possible that that character isn't going to feature prominently or isn't going to have a lot to do in that sort of story. So the GM would need to make sure that there are scenes where that character can thrive, or you need to either rethink the character or rethink the game, rethink the build or the story or whatever it is you're trying to do. So if it happens occasionally, that's fine. It happens occasionally. Just hinder a distinction, grab a D4, grab a plot point, and move on. But if it happens frequently, that's probably indicating that there's a disconnect somewhere that needs to be looked at. SFX are not as scary as they might seem. They just do things. This is an area that trips up a lot of new folks coming to Cortex. So I'm going to read a definition from page 61 of the manual. It's usually some kind of benefit or bonus that only occurs under certain conditions. In Cortex Prime, SFX are used as a way to introduce exception-based rules for trait sets that possess them. They're a way to break the rules of the game, modify the outcome of tests and contests, and add more texture to the story. So they typically have a cost and a benefit. The cost could be a plot point. It could be taking stress. It could be having an asset, like a circumstance, or something that you have, condition. It could be a certain kind of opposition. And the bonus itself can also be a plot point or removing stress or gaining an asset. It could be almost anything. And the best way to see if an SFX works, and the best way to improve your grasp and ability to write solid SFX, is to just play them, do them, write them. And then over time, you kind of get a better feel for how they flow and what they can do and what they might not be able to do. But writing SFX seems to be an area that a lot of folks struggle with. And I think it's because it is an area where the rules are purposefully being broken. You have liberty to bend and break the rules of Cortex. But it doesn't have to be super scary. And the book has some examples, and you can use those examples as stand-ins, and then over time, you'll get a better idea of how to implement them. Forgetting the rules is acceptable, as is implementing them differently, even if it's by accident. This is probably the rule that most applies, or the top 10 thing, the top thing that applies to me personally. Again, you know this if you've gamed with me or watched any of the other videos on my channel. It's okay. You can forget the rules if you're struggling in the moment, especially if it's holding things up at the table. Make a best call and move on. And then it's a learning experience, right? It is incredibly flexible, the framework of Cortex Prime, especially when you are focused in that storytelling direction, because then you can at least follow the story. You can follow the fiction, right? And kind of let the rules take a back seat for a minute. And then later on, if you need to retcon or something like that, you can. But you're not going to break anything if oh my gosh, 20 minutes ago, you remember when we did such and such? I should have rolled the Doom pool for that. I've had entire games, folks, go by. And then I go, oh, we were supposed to be using the Doom pool. You'd think it would be obvious when you're playing, but it's not. It's not always obvious, and it's okay. And everyone has a good time, and that's what's important. Push things player side. So ask questions like, what does your character think or feel or do about this that's happening? It's okay to have the players fill in the time. It's not always, it's not a lecture for the GM to just say a bunch of things and then players roll a bunch of dice and then the GM says a bunch of things. It's collaborative. So there may even be times where something happens that you haven't planned for as the GM, and that's a great time to say, okay, what do you think is behind the door? What do you think would be the most dramatic, most interesting thing to happen in this story that we're telling right now? And let's go with that. Let's roll with that, or put it to the whole table and let everyone kind of contribute. Don't be afraid to push things to the player side. You can be a GM of Cortex Prime with like an index card of notes at tops. You can absolutely make do with minimal prep, and learn to push things player side and let the players tell you, because if the players are telling you, then by definition, that's probably going to be something that the players are interested in, right? You might have some encounter planned with a bunch of cybernetic whales, and you're leading things in that direction, but if you open it up to the players and nobody mentions anything about cybernetic whales, well, then probably whatever's happening is more interesting to the players. So that's a good thing. That's a cool thing to keep everyone engaged. So don't be afraid to push things player side. Cortex Prime is not a system. It is a toolkit, which means that almost everything about it is customizable. And that's a good thing. If your group struggles with a particular aspect of a build, or they're having a really difficult time with a trait set, you can swap things out. It's modular and it's customizable and it's a toolkit, and you use it to build the best build for your table to tell the kind of stories that your table wants to tell. So it's easy to call it a system because it's understandable that people would say it's a system, but at its heart, it's not really. Cortex Prime is not really. Marvel Heroic Role-Playing is a system. That's a more tight, that is one build using Cortex. But Cortex Prime itself is not a system. So don't feel like you can't swap things in and out and see what works best. Your first pass is probably the most true to your vision, but it is also most likely to change. So what do I mean by that? You need to be open to different ways to achieve the build or the character that best realizes your desired experience. Sets and mods that may have seemed perfect in the beginning might actually not be after you get some play testing in or some tinkering, or you see how other mods work together and connect. If you remember on the channel a while back, there was a random, what did we call it? A random Cortex generator or something like that. And honestly, a lot of that was me just rolling random mods and sets, trying to see how they fit together. And a lot of times it was disaster, right? You only see the videos of things that are interesting that I like to share, but there's loads and loads of combinations that didn't work out, builds that just weren't really usable, were just too messy or clunky. And that's a learning experience. So the first pass, if you say, I want to make a game that continues the story of, I really liked the Mighty Max cartoon in the 90s, and I want to pick up where that left off, and I want to keep going with that. Then you might at first think, and I'm definitely going to have this set. I'm definitely going to use these traits. I'm definitely going to use this mod. But then, further on down the page and later on, and once you've had a chance to kind of think about how things connect, you might go, this maybe the most obvious answer was not maybe the best. So be aware of that. It doesn't mean that your original vision is bad. It just means the way you get there might be different than what you initially thought. Okay, it takes time to learn to play well. More time to learn how to run a Cortex game well. And it takes more time to learn how to build well. And not everyone learns the same way. And that's okay. Cortex Prime, I'm going to read my notes here because I want to say this correctly. Cortex Prime can be a major shift from games you may have played before. Things like magic, hit points, encumbrance, finances, cybernetics, all these things might be expressed very differently from other RPGs. Don't be surprised if it takes some time and experience to really get a good grasp of how it works and how it doesn't. And learning one build doesn't mean that you'll immediately understand all builds. Each build is going to be different to its table. So it takes time. It takes time. If you haven't played a Cortex game, it's going to be difficult, not impossible, but difficult for you to have a solid build. If you haven't played enough Cortex Prime, or excuse me, if you haven't built on anything with Cortex Prime, it's probably going to be tricky for you to offer advice in other builds. That doesn't mean that you can't do it, right? It just means experience counts. And so the more experience, the better. So if there's a game that you can get into, I mean, I've run Dragon Prince games and I've watched only 2 episodes of the show, but because I understand Cortex well enough, and I can push things player side and let kind of everyone else take the story and I'm handling the mechanics piece, it was a great time because I have the experience with Cortex. I don't have the experience with the actual show, and that's fine. Over time, when you get to a point where you understand the flow and what's supposed to be happening at the table and understand the build, that's when it really starts clicking, and you find all of these things kind of lining up, and you've got an excellent build, or you really have an excellent character, or you've got a great session planned, and it all pays off, and everybody's happy, and it's good times, and that's really awesome. But it's not necessarily going to be the first time, and it's not necessarily going to be the second time, but eventually you'll get there if you keep at it. All right, it's okay to have less than 3 prime sets, and it's okay to roll less than 3 dice. Less than 3 prime sets just means putting an emphasis on the non-prime sets and on things like assets and oppositions, complications, or stress, or SFX that can bring more dice into your pool. That's fine. You do not have to have 3 prime sets. You also don't need to have the 3 dice in your pool. Less than 3 dice just means less chance of succeeding at an attempt to influence the narrative, but that just means drama. Failure is not a bad thing. It can be just a dramatic moment. It can be exciting, and that's okay. Sometimes characters try their best, but they fail. That's what makes interesting characters. That's what makes interesting stories. So don't feel like you have to have 3 prime sets, and don't feel like you have to have 3 dice in every pool. It should go without saying, but it does, or doesn't always. A healthy table environment is best. Getting used to having safety tools on hand, using session zeros where you discuss the game before you actually play your first session, checking in with players and the GM about whether they're enjoying the game, what did they like, what didn't they like, sort of the debriefing can be helpful, even just during the week. Hey, haven't heard from you. I remember when I ran play-by-post games frequently, the most important element that I discovered was an active out-of-character channel. So not necessarily the in-character thread, but if people were engaged in the off-game channel on the sidelines, then that usually meant the game was going to last longer and it was going to be more enjoyable for everyone else. And that was way back when I didn't even know what a safety tool was. So that was an observation that I made back then. But those kinds of things are it can be a lot of work, and it can be a new, stepping outside your comfort zone, but ultimately it's going to be for the best. And then it helps to avoid the player versus GM dynamic, right? It's not really that. This is about being a collaborative group, and the GM is just another storyteller. They just have a different responsibility than the players do. And sort of tucked into that is the idea that it's not everyone is the same. Not everyone will get the same enjoyment out of the game in the same way. So some characters will want the spotlight, right? They'll look for it and they'll shine. And some players are okay to be in the background and be support characters, or to not contribute so much. And it's important as a GM and as a fellow player to respect that as well. I've talked about meme monsters on the channel many times, and if you've gamed with me, we've talked about meme monsters who hog the spotlight even when it's not their time to shine. And avoiding that sort of behavior can be, and it's tough. It could be a first for someone, but avoiding that sort of behavior and getting to a healthier dynamic where there's a lot of feedback flowing and you have everybody's vibing, like on the same wavelength, then that is ultimately going to make for a more enjoyable experience for everyone at the table, and probably for a longer campaign or something like that, or repeated sessions, as opposed to, we've all had those negative experiences. And I've heard so many folks coming from other games and other experiences that were just so negative, so gross. And I don't want to point fingers at anyone, because I don't think it's any one person's fault. I just think there's a temptation in the gaming culture to kind of drift, if you're not careful, to drift in a sort of negative, gross, toxic direction. And so there are things that you can do that will help to avoid that. So that is a really important piece of having a great time with Cortex Prime, is making sure that everybody at the table is having a great time and that you've got a healthy dynamic. All right, so those are my top 10 things plus 2 bonus things. It's not a catchy thing. Top 12 things, meh. top 10 things plus 2 bonus. Those are what I would go over with somebody who is brand new to Cortex. It doesn't mean all of them will apply immediately right off the bat, but they are the things, sort of blips on my radar that I like to try to cover, or at least touch on in session zeros with new players, or if we're having a conversation and someone is fairly new or inexperienced with the system. Those are kind of my touch points that I like to sort of make sure are all at least addressed, and then the person can do whatever they want with them, or if I'm running the game, we can have that discussion about how to customize it. But those are what I would say are probably my top things to share with new Cortexers. That being said, the channel moving forward, I have a couple different ideas for some videos. This was a video that I really wanted to get out before anything else, but I do feel more and more like I'll be going back to doing the playthroughs, like with Sentinel Man. Remember Sentinel Man? And kind of working off of a different system, or actually possibly using some solo tools to generate stories and then play through those stories. I'm really kind of feeling myself drifting in that direction because I really enjoyed doing that. I went back and watched some of those videos and I had a good time. And who doesn't love Sentinel Man? I mean, that was great. My crowning achievement, Sentinel Man. All right, that's all I've got for today. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day, and Excelsior.